So welcome everybody to this Nasscom conversation on neurodiversity in the workforce. I'm Nupur Junjunwala, the founder of Change Inc., a nonprofit out of India that works on neurodiversity inclusion with a focus on people with learning disabilities. I'm happy to welcome Firoz, who's the Senior Vice President of SAP, Academy of Engineering, and founder of the Industry Autism at Work program. Welcome, Firoz.
Thank you.
And as well as Hiren Shukla, who's the EY Neurodiversity Center of Excellence leader. For those of you all who know, EY, the Neurodiversity Center for Excellence, was actually selected as one of the World Economic Forum's lighthouse projects for DEI. So I'm very excited about this conversation. Thank you for your time. Um, I thought we'd keep this a little bit flowing and candid in terms of what's really happening on the field and what we really need to shift. So my first question to both of you all is, we often hear the term DEI, and it means different things to different people. How do you personally define diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what does it look like in a practice?
All right. Feroz, you want to go first?
Go for it, Hiren.
All right. Nupur, I think that when I go back to the entire concept, diverse teams, inclusive teams will always outperform less diverse, less inclusive teams. And I think the why we are focused on this is actually more important than what we call it, because there has been confusion in the world. We think these are charitable affirmative action programs, but it's actually how do you create value in the world? And you only do this from an inclusion perspective. So to me, diverse perspectives, diverse gender, diversity in age, in all of its aspects, but in a very intentional manner, meaning how do we give each person what they need so they can succeed and contribute to the overall mission of a team or an organization. So diversity, equity, inclusion, at the end of the day, if you do these things right, you will raise performance and you will create new value in the world, both for the organization and the individual at the same time. So we all get to win at the end of the day. But that's how I think about it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Hiren, couldn't agree more. Firoz?
Yeah, I see DI as a mindset, and I'll give you a little bit of context. While I fully agree with what Hiren said, um, I was born in Kerala, brought up in West Bengal, lived in 6 different states of India, and I was very fortunate when I look back that I had such a diverse upbringing because my father was in the Indian Railways. So every 5 years there was a transfer. And like every child, every time there was a transfer, I used to get very sad because I used to miss my friends and move from one place to other and create new friends. Um, that was my initial upbringing. Then I went to REC Warangal. It's now called National Institute of Technologies. And it was based and founded by Nehru with a fundamental idea to build national integration. So every REC, you would have people from all the states of India, which I thought was such a fascinating life experience. I'm a Muslim from Kerala. I ended up marrying a Hindu from Maharashtra. We both were classmates in college. Absolutely, coincidental. But again, what it did was made me understand the power of diversity. My son, who's now 15 years old, is on the autism spectrum. I had no understanding of disabilities. There was nothing in the family. But that opened up a completely new world for me. Now, when I look at all of these life experiences, what it has done to me is made me a much more rounded, empathetic, compassionate, a full person. And so for me, when I look at it, diversity and inclusion, we tend to kind of have these boxes and, gender and disabilities and LGBTQs. And, we will, in the foreseeable future, we'll have new categories. But at the end of it, I see it just as a mindset. The more diverse mindset you are, the more better you become as an individual. And to add to what Hiren said, I think it is not just a business imperative, it's just at the core of what businesses should be doing, and the outcomes will just naturally follow. I don't think this is something which is rocket science. There's enough evidence to show that a diverse team is just a better performing team than a non diverse team. That's how I
So
see it.
I agree with both of you all.
Yeah.
Feroz, I have a bit of a question, right? So
Yeah,
mindset is individual.
Hmm.
yeah,
How do we bring in that mindset into
yeah,
an organizational structure? And I think one of the places that we may want to start with is hiring, right? We tend
yeah,
to hire people that look like us, feel like us, think like us,
Yeah.
right?
absolutely.
And in this space, that's your probably one of your biggest challenges. So if we can talk a little bit about how do we get first diversity in the workforce and then create that mindset, or is it vice versa? I'm not sure.
Good
Hmm.
question. Very good question. And my take is,
Hmm.
again, Hiren spoke about this briefly, is to be intentional about it, right? When I started the Autism at Work program, Nupur, this was in the year 2011. The first time when I went to my HR head, I was the MD of SAP at that time, and I said, "Oh, we have to hire people on the autism spectrum." They were like, "Are you smoking? I mean, this never works." I mean, most people who were on the spectrum didn't have college degrees, so there was no way when we were hiring without a computer science degree, you couldn't get into SAP. But today, just a year ago, SAP said we don't need degrees anymore. We've made progress in 10 years, right? But everything starts like that. People say, this has never been done before. But you have to be intentional. But at the end of the day, we are running a business, and the business outcomes will prove whether it works or not. When I started the Autism at Work program, it took us some time, but over a few years, we were able to show with data that hiring neurodiverse people was good for the organization. We are not doing social service. This is not CSR. This is not charity. This just makes much more business sense than anything else. But all good things, when they start, there was always going to be a pushback. And to maybe just to add a little bit more, Nupur, we had to turn recruitment upside down. I mean, that's just the way it
Yeah.
worked. The traditional recruitment will not allow people who are neurodiverse to get selected because they had anxiety issues, social issues, and many other forms. But if you turn it around and look at what they are good at, I think we can include them in the workforce.
Yeah. Nupur, I really love what Feroz just said. I'm going to pick up from that because, you're asking a very interesting question. Where do we start? How do we drive this conversation in the first place? And we found a couple of interesting things. In the same crowds of DEI, you will find the same people over and over again. So the question is, how do you engage the people who are not in this conversation? Because it's them that we have to talk about. And often, DEI programs have always focused, or disability programs, on the individual and their journey. Now, don't get me wrong, supporting the individual, skilling them, extremely important. But it's the receiving team and the organization that need to be adapted. But they don't understand the why. Why do we need to do this? And I think we can all agree on a few things. One, the world is more complex and complicated than ever. The definition of intelligence, of what we need with the birth of generative AI, is changing everything. Every single job function, it doesn't matter if you're in F&B and retail or if you're in advanced manufacturing, but how we think about the intelligence needed today, diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, diversity of experience. Feroz, I loved your explanation of that background of diversity because for many years, as an Indian born in East Africa, who's a third generation there, where my Gujarati was basically intertwined with Swahili, and I had no idea, okay, that I spoke this way until I spoke to other Indians, always feeling like this outsider, like you don't belong, like you don't fit in. You're always the strange puzzle piece. You can't connect anywhere else. Well, there's disadvantages and there's advantages of that. And I think that today, smart organizations, those that want to not only survive in this hyper connected future, but they want to thrive. harnessing diversity and inclusion is an absolute critical focus. It's no longer a nice to do, it's a have to do. And I think, Nupur, the reason I'm saying all this is triggering the nerves of the people who are not in today's conversation, the business leaders, the decision makers. To Feroz's question, why do we change HR processes? Because it will benefit our organization and it will benefit our own people at the end of the day.
So I think Hiren and Feroz, I'm going to pick up on these two topics about how do we turn hiring upside down, right? Like, it's really coming out of your comfort zone to work with people who are outside your comfort zone. And Hiren, your point about you have to get the system ready to include, right? You cannot include by force fitting people who are diverse to then fit into a system which is structured, right? And I think that's where the challenge happens. As a foundation, we work a lot on that spectrum and we find it very difficult and easy, I think. We find it easy in the sense that when you bring up the different perspective and you train them and you sensitize them and you expose them, I think that's probably the right word, of the possibilities that are beyond their fears, right? It sort of makes them more welcoming and almost excited of being able to work in that. But then this problem of system, like it's taken you for those 10 years to be able to do something. Hiren, I think your journey was a little bit easier or shorter rather, not easier, but like probably not as long with the EY Center. Can we talk a little bit about this a bit more? What does it mean to turn the hiring process topsy-turvy?
Yeah. So just to talk about my own experience at SAP, I think, I often say this, we are actors in a series of coincidences. So the way it started was obviously through my own personal understanding of autism. And I was really fortunate that I was head of SAP then. In SAP's case, we were lucky that we had both a top-down and bottom-up approach. One without the other wouldn't always work. I was fortunate that I had the support from the CEO, who really eventually mandated Autism at Work program as an SAP-wide strategy. So it was very good to have top-down blessings, if I may use the word, because when you're doing something new, you have to have a top-down message. However, we were also very fortunate that we had built up a great bottom-up awareness campaigns and, sensitization workshops, making managers aware of, how they are different, making all the reasonable accommodations. But a lot of these were things that we learned as we actually did it in the first place. And I often say this, a lot of corporations have asked me this question. Okay, Feroz, we want to do autism hiring and I want to hire 100 people. I said, don't hire 100 people, start with one. Because your learning is entirely your learning. While there are best practices that can be shared, I think you have to figure this out as we do it yourself. So I always recommend organizations to start small, start with a handful, learn as you go, and then scale it over a period of time. Don't go this big bang, let's do 100 autism hiring. Then you may make mistakes and people may kind of not get the nuances right. So my take is have both bottom up and top down approach and learn as you go. And even after a decade, I still say we are learning. This is work in progress. We've not perfected it. We are learning every day.
Yeah, Feroz, it's such a vulnerable position to say. In our 9-year journey at EY, we make mistakes, and we are admitting out loud we don't know everything about this because it's not been done before. Nupur, we go back to how do we change systems around? So there was a study that came out late last year that shows 53% of the Gen Z population today, 12 to 27-year-olds, 53% of Gen Z identify as being neurodivergent. Now, this is with both direct diagnosis as well as self-diagnosis, because we know not everyone has the luxury and privilege and access to diagnosis, okay? So let's put diagnosis aside for a second. But the social model of neurodiversity is gaining so much relevance to workforce and hiring that if HR does not adapt job descriptions, if HR and the organization does not adapt the hiring process, we are risking now losing 1 in 2 good candidates. This is not a good hit rate. So again, I'm really providing hopefully our audience the ammunition, the reasons. Why do we drive this change? Because of the relevance of what's there. And at the end of the day, we know that if technology is the great equalizer, generative AI today is a great equalizer on this, okay? Talent is going to be the differentiator. So the best talent will win. Hence, we think that getting the right talent in the door is one piece. And I'll say one last thing here. Today, if we think about Generation Z as 53% neurodivergent, Gen Alpha, the one that's coming after that, is going to be upwards of 70%. Okay. So when we now think about acquiring market share, companies that are producing products that have shopping experience both in person and online, if you want to acquire this market share, you're going to have to be a neuro-inclusive organization with high IQ behind this. If you're not going to acquire this market share. So hopefully these are the nerves that trigger people into action to say, why do I need to start now? As you're hearing from Feroz and I, it takes a long time to get there. And Feroz, 100%. This is not about hiring 100 people, because the true test is, are the 5 people you hired still there 5 years later? That's really the question that we ask, right? And do they have the same opportunities and career mobility? Because if they don't, this has become just a show to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Hiren, it almost sounds like the neurodiverse group is going to become the neurotypical group.
So the
right?
neuromajority and the minority is changing. Yes.
It's changing. And this notion that we forget that the neuro has a diversity in it. So 30% of my workforce is actually neurodiverse, and not one is similar to the other. Even if they may be on the spectrum or they have ADHD, they're all so very different. And yet they find ways to cohesively work together. And I think people often forget that it's not a template that you fit, that an autistic person or a person with autism is a person with learning disability is a certain way, ADHD is a certain way. I think it's important to acknowledge that it comes on a spectrum, and that equal opportunity that you were talking about is important. So, assuming that we do successfully bring them into the system, right? How do you then grow them and help enable them to succeed and grow with an organization? I think that's one of the feedback we get from people is that that's one of the most frustrating things for them, is they're expected to behave in a certain way. They're expected to like repetitive tasks. They don't, it's like, oh, why are you getting bored, or you're autism, and you cannot get bored, right? Those kind of things. Like, what are some of those challenges that you feel in terms of integration or probably including in the workforce?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a few things that we've observed. The first is stereotyping, right? I mean, this is the most common thing. When we started the program, like everybody else, we started saying, okay, testing, repeatable jobs. But very quickly, everybody thinks that's all they can do. I mean, this is common for any industry. When the movie Rain Man was released, everybody assumed that a person who's autistic is like the protagonist in the movie. That's not true. That's just one kind of a person who's on the spectrum. The same thing happened in the tech world, and I have seen autism hiring across the industry when I was chairman for Specialist Turn. The other stereotyping that happens is that, oh, people on the spectrum or neurodiverse people can only do technology jobs. Not true. They can fit in any jobs. We've seen this at SAP. When we started with a specific kind of jobs. Today we have 20 different profiles of people who are on the spectrum. Completely different kind of people, outstanding developers to even very good salespeople. 10 years ago, people said, oh, they can't do that. So I think we should be very careful about what kind of stereotyping we do because it's convenient and it's easy. Oh, let's do this. This is fast, this is quick and dirty, and we can do that. So we should be very careful about stereotyping. This is my first take. The second, and Hiren did mention this, is really focusing on long-term career growth. When we started, the focus was on numbers. What number of people are there who are neurodiverse in the organization? That's one metric. But there's a beautiful law which is called the Goodhart's law, which says that when the target, when the what you're measuring becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? So if you only say we are hiring 1% of people who are neurodiverse, and that's the only metric, then it ceases to be a good measure. I think we should start relooking at the success metric, which is, are they progressing in their careers? Are they taking leadership roles? These are, again, not easy, I would say. SAP has been trying to do this for 10 years. But we should be open to realizing that people who are neurodiverse have the same ambitions as everybody else.
Yeah.
Do not limit themselves. Oh, now they've got a job, so they are happy. No. Why should they be happy with just finding a job? They have the same career aspirations and dreams as you and me have. And so we should treat them like everybody else by making reasonable accommodations. Those are just some aspects I would like to touch.
Yeah.
It's almost like sounding to me like the feminist movement 30 years ago.
Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
almost seems like I feel like I can substitute neurodiversity
Yes.
and women in the workforce easily.
Absolutely.
It's like history
Yeah.
is repeating itself,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
almost.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's interesting because we have really started to double click on the female experience in neurodiversity, which is actually very different. Most data today, most
Yeah.
situations have been created around the male experience
Yes.
around this. And it's particularly the white male experience behind it. People of color, women, very different experience behind it. But Nupur, I'm going to go back to the question here. So,
Yeah.
what happens once these individuals enter the work? So, you have to again go back to a sports team has deliberately different people playing different roles with different strengths because together they make a championship team. You don't get all the same kinds of people. You wouldn't do this because you would fail miserably. In the same way, the concept of the spiky profile of a neurodivergent individual is you're very good at certain things, you're not good at other things. And that profile varies significantly. I think, Nupur, the harm it creates when you are trying to teach a neurodivergent individual and force them to be like everybody else, it shaves all these beautiful edges out and you lose the value, but in fact it creates greater harm in that individual because they have to mask now, they have to pretend, and then we wonder, why is there a greater prevalence of mental health issues and things of that nature? So I think we come at it from the other angle. Our managers, our peers, our buddies, for those, a lot of what I learned from SAP, have we created the support circles and the systems by raising the awareness and the abilities of the rest of the organization to create psychological safety. And this is important because psychological safety is not unique to the neurodivergent population.
Absolutely.
Each of us need this. So hence raising that emotional muscle and IQ really comes from how we as people use language and behaviors to either allow individuals to be themselves and to feel safe and vulnerable, or are we inadvertently, and it's not malicious necessarily, but are we inadvertently creating language and process and barriers that would signal to somebody you should not really be yourself because it's not safe? And I think that's the difference between how we get success and inclusion versus how we perpetuate these unfortunate circumstances.
I think that's so true, Hiren. So for a small organization like us, right, one of the things we realized very quickly is that our ND community was not looking or listening to their human needs like thirst, breaks, bio breaks, hunger, a lot of times. And what happened as culture in the organization, we set up space where we took lunch breaks together, right? As a team, we sat and took those breaks and, asked people, are you drinking enough water? We had a new person join the team and they actually left within 15 days saying that this team is too woke for me. Like, who asks whether you've had a glass of water or not, right? And I think that cultural setting, even if it's at that fundamental human connect, for us, it was team building. For this person, it was like so weird. So I think that sort of culture building takes a lot of mindfulness and intention besides just the business part of delivery. I think
Yeah.
ultimately we spend so much time at work, you need the human connect. Even if you assume that people with
Yeah.
autism do not have a human, an EQ, they still need that connect. So I think we're almost out of time. So I'm going to ask two more questions. How, what is the role of recruiters and hiring? How do you get the pipeline and, invite these folks into your workplace and encourage them to apply to your organization?
Hiren, you want to go first? You can go.
Yeah. Let me take a shot. So, the first thing that we start advocating is talk. Let's start talking about this. Let's start using language, even if it's not the perfect language. But you must talk about this because if you don't talk about it, you're never inviting others to the table. So, one, talk about this, talk about it frequently, talk about it to candidates because this is a non-apparent condition. You would not know that somebody's neurodivergent necessarily. So I think recruiters and others, they must be trained in the vocabulary and a bit of the circumstances behind it. And then they need to start talking about it. And for example, when they do an interview, they may say, is there anything that you need, candidate, that allows you to? And it could be, I need to turn my camera off because if my camera's on, I'm using all my energy to look at you and I'm not being able to think. So I think recruiters often can elevate that experience and bring more qualified candidates in if they begin talking about it and offering adaptations to the process. So, Rose, I'll pause and see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, the entry point is the recruitment system. So I think you have to make sure that recruiters are aware, are sensitive. You follow, recruitment processes that are unique and different to people who are neurodiverse. So that for me is a given. But what's also interesting is that we found, again, based on our own experience at SAP, that the people who were successful, the neurodiverse people who were successful, also had very sensitive, caring managers. In fact, if you turn that around, you would find that the good managers are very good at handling neurodiverse people. So it can be a good test in some cases to see how good is your management bench. I've seen, and by the way, this is not unique to neurodiverse people. It's the same for us. We thrive under good leaders and good managers, but at least it gets much more amplified when it is neurodiverse because you have to be intentional about it, right? And you need to have a little bit more patience, a longer runway. So I think, at least in SAP's case, we were fortunate being the first one off the block when it comes to hiring people who are neurodiverse. Our inbound requests are extremely high because SAP is known for the Autism at Work program. But as I said, it is to ensure that you have a process, an end-to-end process, which starts at hiring to onboarding to sensitization workshops to having buddies, like you said, Nupur. Buddies are so important to take care of their everyday small needs. Once you have the entire chain, I think you will have a better throughput. But sometimes, even if one of them is broken, you could not see success. So I think having an end-to-end process is very important.
So I want to go back to that thought that you started with, right? Where you said now SAP doesn't require degrees to come in
Yeah.
to apply for a position. To a
Yes.
layperson or to a traditional recruiter manager, this sounds like, oh my God, my quality is going down the dump,
Yeah.
right? Like I thrive on these numbers that I'm in the top school, top GPA, all of this stuff. How do we sort of reconcile that taking alternative approaches doesn't necessarily mean reducing rigor
Yeah.
or
Absolutely.
compromising on quality?
Yeah, I think we are living in an AI world where a lot of things that we have done the traditional way will get questioned. And again, this has nothing to do with hiring neurodiverse people. This is just redefining work itself, right? I mean, Jensen Huang, who's the founder of or the CEO of NVIDIA, says that we don't need engineers anymore because everybody is a developer. I mean, so the
Half the
fundamental
Indian
question.
population right
Yeah,
there. Indian origin
everybody.
population.
Yeah, I mean, and the other extreme is Temple Grandin, who's a very dear friend of mine, who's a icon when it comes to autism. She says 50% of Silicon Valley is autistic. Somebody or the other is on the spectrum. So, I mean, these are all different points of views, but eventually, what we are trying to say is the same thing, that we need to figure the best possible way to include the most competent people who can add value to your business, and degree is not the only way to do that. I'm not saying having
That's
good
important.
degrees, or if you're a Harvard graduate doesn't mean that you are not welcome to an organization. That's not the goal, but that's not the only thing that you should be looking for. I think that's what we are trying to tell here.
Yeah, yeah. I'll add just one quick thing to this, Nupur. One is most neurodiversity hiring models have pivoted from a behavioral based interview where I just ask random questions to somebody to a performance based process, which means those candidates actually have to do some performance as part of the interview process. In fact, that is much more rigorous and much
Right.
Yeah.
more telling whether somebody's capable of doing the job. So I think that is one kind of pivot towards, do you need degrees or not? And in fact, you don't. But the
Yeah.
other part of this is SAP, EY, many other organizations have already created success. We have the data points here. So those recruiters that are nervous, oh my God, you're reducing quality. Look at the examples on what SAP's done. Look at the examples of what EY has done. So hence, I think there are shoulders to be stood on here. There's data and proof that other companies like ours have already created. And so I think today companies are not starting from scratch. It's a very different world than when Feroz started this, and then when he was. It's very different today. Today, there's much more proof and data and process there.
So, as we conclude, last question, closing remarks or comments for people who are starting to think about this and people who are sitting on the fence that, I've done the sensitization, but you know what? I just can't do that hiring, take that risk. What is your advice to them?
Just do
So
it.
that's yeah.
I mean,
Well said. Well said. Yeah.
I've spent 10 years trying to convince people. I mean, the
Yeah.
people who need to be convinced will get convinced. The people who will not will eventually lose out. So I think give it a try. You may have some thoughts and ideas, but unless you do it, you won't know it. So very simple answer, just do it. But the other, and we should be very aware of this, is the pendulum of D&I moves from one extreme to the other. So just be aware of that. And it could be political situations in the world and so many other factors. So that keeps shifting. But I think we should just be evidence based. Don't be emotional about it. Look at the data, look at the evidence. If it makes sense, do it. If you
Yeah.
are not convinced, don't do it. And I just say, I'm a parent, so I may have a little bit of emotional bias towards this topic, but I always tell others that don't be emotionally biased. Look at the data, look at the facts, follow the process, and you will yourself come to your own conclusions, which I'm pretty convinced will be the one towards including neurodiverse people in the workplace.
Yeah. Well said, Feroz. Nupur, I would say data today shows that somewhere between 10 to 20% of existing workforce, meaning already employees of these organizations, neurodivergence is already there. So one, you have a care of duty obligation to your existing employees. So to Feroz's point, you must get educated behind this. Two, we talked about the Gen Z 12 to 27-year-olds. This is the workforce we will be hiring for the next 10 years at least. If you don't start now, you'll never gain the